Hi everyone! As we move into our screen printing project, let's talk first about all of the tools and materials that you have in your screen printing kit. First of all, we have 3 jars of ink. 2 of them are black ink. One says acrylic, one says it's for fabric. And then we have 1 jar of red ink that also says it's fabric. Now I do want to point out that this acrylic ink is for paper and pretty much any other materials that you want to print on, if you want to print on wood or metal or plastic. Fabric and acrylic ink are a little bit interchangeable, but the fabric just is a little bit thicker. So you could also use the fabric ink to print on paper as well. Let's see, what else do we have in here? We have 2 substances. One is called drawing fluid and one is called screen filler. This is going to help us get images onto the screen that we're working on. And then we have a Speedball Speed Clean, and this is for cleaning the screen after you are finished printing. This is what we call a squeegee. We have, again, a fabric side and a graphic side, and they're pretty similar. One side is just slightly thinner than the other, and if you get them mixed up while you're printing, it's probably going to be okay in most cases. Now let's see, some small tools that we have in here. We have a couple of stir sticks, little wooden stir sticks, an X-Acto knife, a paintbrush. There is a book of screen printing instructions. We are going to go through 2 different printing processes, and they are both in this book, along with the cleanup and a lot of other information. So if you want to take some time to read through, there is one, the photo emulsion section, that we're not going to do in this project, but we will be printing with screen drawing fluid and screen filler, and we are also going to work with a cut paper stencil as well. You also have a pad of marker paper. This is what we're going to be using for our stencil. This is 9 by 12 inches, which is a great size for this screen. All the way at the bottom, oh, there's another stir stick tucked away in there. And down here at the bottom, you'll see this is the screen that we'll use to screen print with. I want you to check to make sure that your screen is clean and there are no holes. You can hold it up to the light to look through the screen to make sure that it is in good shape, and it should feel kind of tight like the surface of a drum. There should be no soft areas. Okay, so the first thing we want to do with this screen is to seal the edges with some screen tape. I'm going to move some of these other things out of the way. If your screen is already covered, or the edges of your screen is already covered with the screen tape, then you don't have to worry about this step. You can just skip it, move on to the printing section. But if your screen is bare like this, let's go ahead and protect these edges with this screen tape. And what it is a water-resistant tape that's super sticky, and that really helps with cleaning up and not letting these edges be filled with ink while you're printing. So I'm going to start on the inside first of all. And just be aware that this is super sticky. All right, I'm going to cut off a long strip. And I'll first set the edge down inside. I'm trying to keep it fairly close to the wooden frame so we don't cover up too much of the screen. And just press it down nice and even. And fold it over the wooden frame. Sometimes it helps to trim a little bit of it so it can stretch over the frame. And I do want to make sure that all the edges are pressed down really nice and flat. And I'll just flip it around and do the same on the other side. And we'll do it on all 4 sides. Now, I've mentioned that this screen tape is super, super sticky, and I do want you to please be careful to pull it up gently. If you accidentally get it stuck down on the screen, if you yank it, there's a tendency for that adhesive to hold onto the screen. You could actually tear a hole in the screen. So if you accidentally get it down in the wrong spot, just pull it up very gently and take your time, and try not to slide it across the screen as you're working on it, because that adhesive will just hold on to it. Now, if you don't have screen tape, you could use packaging tape. Clear packaging tape works just as well. This screen tape does tend to last longer though, because of the highly adhesive qualities of it. But if you use packaging tape, you might have to just take off the packaging tape and replace it every now and then, probably more often than this red screen tape. Once you're finished with the interior of your screen, we're going to flip it over and do the same thing all the way around the outside. And I do want to point out that when we're doing it on the outside, cut off a piece of tape. And what we want to do is line up the edge of the tape with the edge of the tape that you see on the interior as close as possible, so that it creates one nice, good, solid seal. Now I'm finding there are a couple of edges along the sides that the tape, it just doesn't want to lie down. So I'm just going to put an extra piece of tape across those edges, and I'll end up covering pretty much all of the wooden surface, and that's fine. That'll actually make it even easier to clean up afterwards. So here you can see I have a screen that's completely covered with screen tape front and back. I've actually covered all the surfaces of the wood with screen tape as well, because I just think that the screen tape is a lot easier to clean up after you finish printing, and if the wood is sealed underneath this tape, it'll last longer because there's no moisture that gets to it. So it'll be less likely to warp, and it'll be less likely to rot, so you'll end up having a screen that lasts a much longer time if it's completely sealed like this. Now, in this kit, there are 2 different ways of getting an image onto the screen so that you can screen print it. And what I'm going to do is use both methods to create one image. One of the methods is by using a combination of drawing fluid and screen filler. I'm going to show that in a second part of the demonstration. So for now, I'm going to set these aside. Another way is to use this marker paper as a stencil. So it's kind of a thick paper that is slightly translucent. I'm going to go ahead and tear a sheet off right now, and I'll set the rest of the pad aside. And what I have here is an image that I drew. It's of a brayer, a printing brayer that's on fire. So what I'm going to do is use this image using both methods. Now I could use one method for the entire image. I'm really just breaking it up into these different two methods just for the sake of this tutorial. But I just want you to know that you could choose one method for your print if you want to. You don't have to go with both. What I'd like to do first of all is make sure that the image fits my screen. I did go ahead and trace out 9 inches by 12 inches for a frame to make my drawing in, and I think that's gonna fit, but I just like to always check to make sure, and that looks pretty good. Now what I'm gonna end up doing is have a squeegee that pushes ink from one side to the other. So whether you're doing it from top to bottom or side to side, you want to have at least an inch all the way around to give yourself some space to put some ink down. And you'll see that later on in the printing demo. But I think this is going to be a good, good image for printing, whether I print up and down or side to side. I'm going to set my screen aside for now. And what I want to do is use this marker paper as a stencil that blocks out ink when I'm pushing it through the screen. So I think what I'll do is go ahead and set it down on my drawing. You can see a little bit of it still coming through. Let me check again. I think that frame, yeah, in order to get this image centered on the screen, this top line is not the one I'm going to follow. I actually want it to be a little bit higher. So that's actually where I want my stencil to fall as well. So it goes around there, I would say. All right, now we can set this aside, and I'm just going to tape it down so that it stays in place while I trace it. And I'm just going to take a pencil and trace over the drawing that's already there. And if you have a light table, that sometimes helps to be able to see through the paper if you're having a hard time seeing the image. It also can be done on a window. If you want to tape this to a window and let the light of the window shine through, you can see through it that way as well. All right, I'm going to pull up one side to check if oh, look at that. I actually had 2 sheets of this marker paper. But I just wanted to check to make sure I got the whole image. That looks pretty good. I don't think I missed anything. I'm not going to need that second sheet. I'll put it aside. All right, that looks good. Now I'm going to use this as the stencil for printing. Now before I can use it as a stencil, I'm going to have to cut this shape out. And I'm going to get a cutting mat. And this is why you have an X-Acto knife in your kit. It has a very sharp blade. Please be very careful with this sharp blade. It is brand new, so it can cut very easily. And what you're going to do is cut out the areas where you want the ink to go through, where you want the print to actually be. And I already know when I made this drawing that this is the area that I'm actually going to print in red. So I can just color it in real quick just to make sure I don't miss anything. But it ends up being really just one big shape. And I'm noticing, I'm going to finish this real quick and I'll show you, there's this one area right here. This shape, if I cut this whole thing out, this shape's actually going to fall away. So in order to keep that from disappearing, I need to somehow connect it. So I think I'll connect it right here. That's what I'm gonna do. And make this one large shape here. All right, so now I'm gonna use the X-Acto blade and just cut out very carefully around these lines. Okay, now that I've finished cutting the image area out, I can see how it looks. I'm going to compare it again to the drawing. It's looking pretty good. And I'll set it again against the screen and decide a general area where I want it to be attached for printing. And it looks like this, the top seam is right across where the tape is with a bit of a gap near the bottom. So I want to tape this to the screen in the same way that I saw it through the screen. In this way, you can see where the ink is actually going to come through the screen. This is where it gets pressed through while the rest of it gets blocked away. And you'll notice that there's some screen that's exposed across the top and some screen that's exposed across the bottom. And what we're going to do is use some tape to tape the stencil paper to the screen and at the same time block out those areas where we don't want any more ink to come through. I feel like this tape is maybe not quite wide enough to cover that entire area, so I'm going to use 2 pieces just to make sure I get good coverage to completely cover this gap of screen showing below. Now this part can really be used, you can really use any kind of tape for taping this down, masking tape, scotch tape, or packaging tape. It doesn't really matter what kind of tape you use for this. Just make sure that it's secure all the way around. And we have a screen ready for printing. I'm going to go ahead and cut my papers and get my inks ready, and let's go ahead and make some prints. All right, so when you're ready to make some prints with your screen, what you'll need is to have your screen prepared with a stencil, and you'll also need your ink. I'm going to print mine in red, so I have my red ink along with a stir stick. You also need a couple of cards. I'll show you what this is for, or just some sort of a lift. So this is like a scrap mat board, some tape, your squeegee. You're also going to want to have nearby your drawing, a few sheets of newsprint cut to the same size as your printing paper for scrap prints, and then all your printing papers that are already cut down. I'll go ahead and set these aside. And to prepare your screen for printing, one thing that you will need to do is to give it some lift on the 4 corners. So when the screen is placed face down onto a piece of paper and then ink is pushed through it, this screen is just resting right on the paper. And in order to have a really nice clean print, you actually want the screen to kind of pop up away from the paper as the ink is pressed through it. So we want to give it just a slight lift. I'm exaggerating here a little bit because we're just giving it the lift of basically the thickness of a sheet of mat board or some scrap cardboard that you have around, even some folded piece of paper, and some people use coins. So if you have a quarter, you can stick a quarter, 4 quarters, or 4 pennies. And what we want to do is give this lift an equal amount of lift on all four corners of the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and just tape these down. Okay, I have lifts on all four corners. Now when I lay it down to print, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little bit of a spring back. So when I press down with the squeegee and the ink, it'll just kind of pop up away from that paper, giving it a nice clean edge where the ink doesn't just bleed right through. All right, so let's see, one more thing we want to do before we start printing is to create a registration system. Now if you're just making single prints on your paper, one single run prints on your paper, you might not need to go through this step, but if you're going to do multiple runs like I am, what I want to do is make sure that my screen, I'm going to go ahead and just pull out one sheet of printing paper. I just want to make sure that my screen always falls on the piece of paper in the same place every time, because I want this flame to be lined up in the right place above the brayer, so I don't really want it floating around or separated. So there are a couple of ways you can do this. The easiest way is to use what's called a hinge clamp, which is what we have in Holden Studio, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute. But if you don't have access to a board with hinge clamps on it, here is one option that's maybe not ideal, but it helps. So what I'm going to do is turn the screen so you can see the whole screen. And what I want to do is decide where I want my image to fall on the piece of paper. And for me, I just want it pretty much centered. So I'm going to give it a little bit of tape just to hold it in place. And you're going to see that when you put the screen on top, you can actually see your image through the screen. So then what you want to do is line it up in just the right spot so that it falls in the right place. So I see my lines are lining up. And at this point, I'm going to, I'm just going to draw a line because I have my table covered with paper that I can draw with. If you can't draw directly onto your table, you could use tape to mark this out. So I'm just drawing one edge because I want my screen to always fall right on that corner every time I print. And then I want my paper to always be in the same spot as well. And in this case, I will actually use tape because it's kind of helpful to see the corners with tape. I'm just going to mark these two corners at the bottom. So again, this doesn't create perfect registration, but it does help get things in the right place each time. So every time you put a piece of paper down to print, you're going to put your paper in that corner, and then you're going to set your screen down on the lines that you've already created. And then you can make the print and lift it up, and you'll know that each time the sheet of paper falls in the same spot. Now, if you're printing in Holden Studio, we have these boards already created with these clamps that are called hinge clamps. So they clamp together here, and they're on a hinge on this side, so they fall up and down on these wooden boards. And the way they work is by lifting up the clamps so that your screen fits just inside there, and then screw down the wing nut so that it's tightened into place. By the way, if you don't have one of these boards but you would like to have one, they're really easy to make. It's just a wooden board that you can get from any home improvement shop. And these hinge clamps can be ordered from a lot of different art stores. We've ordered ours from Blick, where we get most of our art supplies from. So you can always make a board just like this if you'd like to. They're not expensive. And what happens is it hinges in a way, I'm going to show you, it's holding it underneath here, and they're hinging in a way that the board the screen always falls in the same spot each time. And now all we need to do is just line up the paper underneath. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put my drawing underneath and just look through the screen to make sure the image is exactly where I want it to fall. Let's slide it over just a little bit. Right there. All right, so I know that this is where I want the screen to always fall on the paper, which should always land in this spot. So again, I am going to do the same thing. I'm going to mark the corners with tape. And I know some of this might be off camera at this point, so I'm going to move this board around so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I have those blue tapes marking the corners of where my paper falls each time. And the screen will always land in the same spot. Oops. Now I'm ready to get the ink out. I have my squeegee ready and one of the stir sticks that comes in your kit. So if you have a brand new jar of ink, you might notice inside, actually when I first opened my jar of ink, there's a little covering, a protective covering that's usually stuck on it. So what you can do is just peel that protective covering off, throw it away, and then you might notice that there's a piece of plastic. So this is keeping the ink sealed so that it doesn't dry. So what you'll need to do is take your X-Acto knife and just cut it right around the edge. All right, you can throw that away. Well, this is a good reminder that it gets pretty messy around here, so it's handy to have some paper towels and a spray bottle with some water, or just a damp paper towel, just to clean up some messes as you go. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stir up this ink a little bit. So screen printing ink has qualities that are a lot like paint. It tends to be kind of runny, and it doesn't really need to be warmed up like we usually do with a lot of other printmaking inks. But I do like to stir it up just to make sure that the color is well mixed, make sure there aren't any lumps of dried ink in there. It's looking pretty good. So my ink is ready. I'm going to prepare a sheet of newsprint. Let's see, I'll flip this over. Now the first print you always want to make is always going to be on newsprint, because the first print is pretty much always going to be a mess. It's usually not a very good, crisp, clean print. You're sort of like prepping the screen in a way, so usually I just use a scrap piece of newsprint, and I know that it's not going to turn out really well, and that's fine. And before I print, I do want to show you something. I'm going to be putting the squeegee down. I'm putting some ink down. I'm going to use the squeegee to push this ink across, but because it can get a little messy, I'm going to show you here the angle of the squeegee. Now I don't want to lean it down really low and squeegee the ink across. I also don't want the squeegee to be standing straight up at 90 degrees, but I want it somewhere halfway in between, so around 45 to 65 degrees is a good angle for pulling the ink across. And then what we're going to do is what's called flood the image when we take the ink and push it back. So use the same angle when you push it back and pull it across. So again, it's not going to be straight up and down. It's not going to be laying real flat. Somewhere in between, about 45 degrees. All right, so now we can start off by putting a line of ink, and we want to go ahead and put a pretty nice amount so that we'll know there's enough going through the screen and onto the paper, and plenty left over to keep making prints. So basically you're putting down all the ink that you want to use to make prints with. You can always add more as you go along the way as well. So I'm checking to see if I'm using the graphic side of the squeegee or the fabric side, and I do want to use the graphic side. And the first thing you want to do is lift it up away from the paper and just flood the screen with the ink. So you're just pushing the ink into the screen. And then you're going to set it down and actually make the first print. And it looks like I don't actually really have much ink on here. I pretty much used all of that ink just to flood it. So I'm going to go ahead and put down plenty more ink. Notice that I'm spreading the ink in a way that covers the entire screen, or at least the entire image area. And the squeegee itself is the perfect size because it also covers the entire image area. So now that I'm printing, I have the screen down flat. I'm going to give it some pressure and push the ink back across. And then I can lift the screen up to take a look at this first proof. So like I said, it's a little bit messy. It usually misses some areas. That basically happens for your first proof. Let's try it again. This time I'm going to use my printing paper. I'm setting it down with my guides in mind to make sure they're in the right spot. And again, I'm going to flood the screen. I actually usually flood the screen going back. I like to flood going back. And then I set it down and I print pulling forward. Now let's lift it up and see how this print looks. That's a little bit better. I think that might have happened from all the extra flooding that didn't need to happen. So let's make one more. And remember that I have this resting on those cardboards that were on each corner, so it's not actually sitting down on the table. Another reason it's good to lift your screen up a little bit. I'm setting down my next sheet of paper, again with those guides, helping me put the paper in the right spot. I'm going to set it down. Oh, before I set it down, I want to flood. And flooding basically means you're just filling all of those holes with ink, all the holes in the screen. And this is the printing pass. All right, starting to look a little bit cleaner. I think some of this is just leftover ink that got bled through. And I'll maybe see those on another one or two more prints. But otherwise, this is pretty much what I want to see. It's a nice thick layer of ink. It's pretty solid coverage. And I'm going to go ahead and make all of my prints with this red ink, and then I'll come back and print the second part, the second run, in black. All right, hold on just a minute. I'm just realizing now that I'm getting into production mode that I am forgetting one step, which is usually, it's not the step that I'm forgetting, but the timing. The flood should happen almost right away. What I'm realizing is that sometimes I have to walk away and put the prints away into my drying rack, and what happens is the screen starts to dry. This ink is acrylic-based ink or water-based ink, so it dries as it's being exposed to the air, and you definitely don't want the ink that's inside your image area to dry if you happen to walk away. So you definitely do want to keep printing and printing as you're working, but if you do need to walk away to go answer the phone or go to the bathroom or something, just make sure that your image area is flooded so that there's plenty of ink in there. And then when you come back to print, there should be still wet ink ready to go. So the process is to print, lift, flood, and then pull the print out to see how it came out. Sometimes it's really easy to want to look at the print right away and forget to flood, but we definitely want to keep the image area of the exposed screen full of ink so it doesn't dry. Now, if for any reason you do need to walk away and you're not going to be for a while, but you don't want this ink to dry, it's handy to have that water bottle. You can give it a little bit of a spritz that keeps it wet if you're going to be gone for a while. Just know that when you come back, the first couple of prints is going to be a little bit wet, so you want to do those first few on newsprint again before you get back into printing on your printing paper. Okay, once you've made your last print, what you want to do is actually save this ink. This is one of those cases where instead of throwing out the ink, we do want to save it because, as you can tell, there's a lot of leftover ink in this process. So we want to save as much of it as we can, and if you haven't mixed it with another color, it can go straight back into the jar. If you have mixed a specific color that you've been wanting to use, you can just put it in a different kind of Tupperware or some sort of storage container, and you can always pull it back out again another time and keep printing with it. As long as it's covered and protected from air, it'll last for a pretty good long time. So I'm scooping as much ink as I can back into the jar. I'm going to set some newsprint here off to the side, a place to put my squeegee. And this is when it's kind of handy to have a little spoon as well. I like to just scoop up some of this leftover ink with a spoon and just scoop it right back into the jar again. All right, I've got most of it put away. I'm going to cover up this jar and set it aside. And now what we need to do is clean off the screen with some water. And we'll go ahead and clean the squeegee with water as well. And I'm going to unhook it from these hinge clamps. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and take the squeegee off one more time. Just remembering that on the other side, we have the paper stencil. At this point, we can't really keep this paper stencil. It's done. So we're going to go ahead and peel it off, and I can peel these cards off as well. And these I can set aside to use again later. But since this is a paper stencil, it's going to have to be thrown away. If it were a Mylar stencil, maybe we could wash it and reuse it. But this one cannot be reused. When you're finished printing and you want to wash all of the ink away, first make sure there's very little ink left in the screen because you don't want a lot of this ink going down the drain. And then what you want to do is just rinse everything off in the water. And sometimes I've noticed that it helps to have a green scrubby pad to clean off the squeegee. And you definitely want to make sure you get all of the ink off because the ink that's left behind will dry, and it tends to dry very hard. It could damage the screen down the road if you're printing with it again. So take your time to scrub it down both sides, and especially along the edge to make sure all the ink is washed away. And you can set that aside to dry. The screen can also be rinsed, but I wouldn't use the green scrubby on a screen. I would worry about damaging the screen. So I like to use some sort of a soft brush to just brush over it. And you'll see this ink start to wash away from the interior of the screen. Now you might notice a little bit of staining, but if the ink stains the screen, that's okay. As long as the open holes of the screen area stay open, then it still works fine, and it's just a little bit of a stain that's not going to affect any future prints. So we've talked about how to make a screen for screen printing using the paper stencil method. And what I'd like to show you now is the second method that's available in this kit, and that's by using the drawing fluid and the screen filler combined method. And it's basically drawing onto the screen the image that you want to print. So what you're going to need is, first of all, the bottle of drawing fluid. The screen filler we're going to set aside for now, but what we need is drawing fluid and the paintbrush, your original drawing, And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and put those lifts back on the four corners of the screen as well, because we do want a little bit of a lift when we draw this image on to separate it from the paper. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. Okay, so the reason we want these lifts on the screen is because we're going to pick up the screen and flip it over onto the drawing. So again, we print through the screen in this direction, and the print that we make is going to look like this. So if you want it to look like you're drawing, you're going to flip the screen over. And again, try to get it centered. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered. We'll do the registration later on when we put the paper down for printing. But I remember that I wanted it pretty much centered in the screen. So that looks pretty good right there. And I'm noticing it's not resting directly onto the paper. So it is important that it's not resting directly on the paper. One other thing I should mention before you start adding this drawing fluid to the screen, this should be a very, very clean screen and degreased. So I've actually just cleaned it after that last printing that you saw, and cleaned it really well. And so I know that it's ready to go. It was a little bit wet, but I dried it with my hair dryer to make sure that the screen itself is dry. If you're just pulling the screen out of this box and you haven't printed with it before, or if it's been a while and you're not sure if it's clean, I would just spritz it down with some sort of a degreaser like Simple Green, and then rinse it off with in the sink or just with some tap water. And then again, make sure the whole screen is dry. And if this screen itself isn't dry yet, just blow over it with a hair dryer, or just let it sit for a couple of hours until you know it's dry, because it does need to be dry and degreased and very clean before we add this drawing fluid. I like to give it a little shake, make sure it's all mixed up really well. And you'll see that it's kind of a blue, thick blue liquid. And what we want to do is apply this drawing fluid in all the areas where you want the image to be, or where you want ink to be. So I'm going to go ahead and draw out this whole brayer because I want all of it to be inked. After you finish drawing the image area with the drawing fluid, what you'll want to do is remember, first of all, to clean your brush out really well afterwards so that the drawing fluid doesn't dry in your paintbrush. You can just wash it with tap water. And this area that has been painted with a blue drawing fluid just needs to dry to the touch before you move on to the next part of the process. I usually like to go ahead and do all of this drawing and then let it rest overnight, come back the next day for the next part of the process. But if you're in a hurry, you can set it up in front of a fan to dry a little bit more quickly, or dry it with a hair dryer. Now you can see there are a few spots here that look kind of shiny and wet, but this is actually dry to the touch. And this side is dry now as well. So we can move on to the next step. I'm going to set aside the drawing fluid and pull out now the screen filler and a squeegee for the next part of this process. I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen around so you can see the full screen this time. And again, I'm going to give this a little bit of a shake to make sure that the mixture is well mixed inside this bottle. And what we're going to do now is to cover the rest of the screen with the screen filler, which is going to act then as the stencil to the printing process, because this blue drawing fluid will then get washed out. So let's go ahead and pour some of this screen filler onto the screen. I have this squeegee nearby, and you'll just pour it onto the screen across the top. And then take your squeegee and run it down the length of the screen, making sure you cover the whole image area. Now, if you see there's some areas that didn't get covered, that's okay. We're going to cover those areas up with tape, and that will be blocked off with tape before we print. and whatever leftover screen filler can be put back into the bottle. Once all of the screen filler is dry to the touch, we are ready to seal up all of those exposed areas of the screen. I'm going to just cover those areas with just plain clear packaging tape this time. And once those areas are covered, then I'm going to take the screen back to the sink and wash out this drawing fluid with just clean tap water. So as you can see, because the drawing fluid is dissolvable by water, we can just wash it away in the sink and at least behind the screen filler, which does not dissolve in water. And this leaves the open space of the screen again open so that you can push the ink through, and this is what's going to create the image that you'll print. So now we're ready to print the second run of our 2-color print. All right, I'm going to go ahead and use the board with the hinge clamps again like I did before, but we're going to have to do a little bit of registration again for the second color because I don't know exactly where the screen was set down along the edge of these hinge clamps the first time, and that's all right because we're going to register the second run now before we start printing. So again, I'm tightening down the frame with these hinge clamps. It's going to fall always in the same spot on the board. These are the marks, the tape marks that I had used previously. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of those. I don't need those anymore. And for this, I'm going to use one of those first prints that had a few mistakes on them. These are really handy to have as proof prints, just to do things like this registration and for some of the first prints that we make. And what we can do is usually see through the image and figure out exactly where you want that second one to fall. So I can see just a little bit of that flame right there through the screen, and I'm going to lift it up to exactly where I want it to fall, just above that brayer. I think that looks just about right. I'm going to then lift my screen up out of the way and again make those marks using tape on the corners where I know I want to always put my paper down in place. I'm going to take the paper out and I'm going to go ahead and get the black ink, and I'm going to go through the printing process in much of the same way. I'm going to first put down the ink, this time across the bottom. Again, I'm going to find the graphic side of my squeegee. I'm going to lift it up and first flood the image area. Set my paper down in place. And again, this is like scrap paper or a piece of newsprint. This is one of the misprints from earlier, so I don't mind if it messes up. Giving it even pressure, I'm going to push down, and this is the printing pass. And then lift it up, flood the screen, and then let's take a look at our print. Kind of squished through a little bit. First print's always a mess. I think the screen's still a little bit wet as well. So let's do a second pass and see how the second one looks. Print pass. I'm pulling the paper away before I do the flood pass. And now I can take a look at how the print looks. That looks pretty good, but I'm noticing that it's a little bit off center. I'd like to shift the paper over just a little bit to center it a little bit better. So I'm going to shift those guides over, and then I'm going to finish printing the rest of my edition. So you'll wash away the ink in the same way as before. Just use some tap water, a scrubby pad, Remember to put any excess ink back into the jar so that we have very little ink going down the sink, going down the drain. Once you finish cleaning all the ink off your screen, remember to remove any of those lifts that were left behind on the corners, and then also remove any of the packaging tape that you had used as masks. And then we're going to clean off the screen filler, and for that we're going to use the bottle of Speed Clean that is also in your kit. What you'll want to do is first lay the screen flat, give the cleaning solution another little bit of a shake, and we're going to just pour the solution on the surface of your screen. Make sure to cover all of the areas where that screen filler is. And we're going to let that solution sit on the screen for about 2 to 3 minutes to let it dissolve the screen filler. After you've let the cleaning solution sit on the screen filler for a few minutes, it should be dissolved and ready to wash away with some water and a soft brush.